Hello everybody and welcome. In this video we're going to go ahead and make our own custom ambient occlusion map. Ambient occlusion maps simply tell a rendering engine where light can reach really well, i.e. the white areas, and where it finds it difficult to reach, like in the crevices and dark patches within the wheel arches. Now, by being able to create your own custom ambient occlusion map for your game assets, that does mean that you can make your game more performant. Let's go find out more. Okay, so this is our model here. Now, first of all, I want to show you what ambient occlusion kind of looks like. If we go over to our render properties, whilst we're in Eevee, so it's nice and quick to begin with, let's go ahead and make sure we've got a tick in ambient occlusion. If you don't, then the next scene will be black. Let's go over to our render tab at the very top and switch it to rendered viewport shading. There we go, we've got ourselves this, and of course you can be following along with any particular model at this point in time. Let's use the drop down here and change the render pass from combined to ambient occlusion. Now this will give us an approximation as to what the ambient occlusion will end up looking like. And as we can see here, areas in which light is difficult to get into are darker than areas it's not. And if we go underneath the car, you would expect it to all be dark, but remember there's no ground in this scene, so there's nothing to stop light from the ambient light, that is any light in our world, from hitting the bottom of our object. And we don't want to colour this in dark anyway, because if the car ended up flipping in game, we don't want it to look artificially dark on the bottom. We can do that with just a darker material if necessary. Okay, so that's an approximation, but unfortunately, we cannot use Eevee to bake out an ambient occlusion map. But we can use cycles, and then we can control the quality as well. The first thing we will want to do is unwrap our model. Now, if I go into solid shading mode, select my car, we won't focus on the wheels today, we'll just focus on the car, the interesting bit, and go into edit mode, you will see that this is in fact a mirrored model. This is important because if you have set up your model like this and now you're about to do your mapping, baking out your normal maps, in this case the ambient occlusion map, if in game you decided that using vertex painting or some other method you could add scratches to the car as you impact the world around you, because we're using a reflected model, then that means that the damage would also be reflected automatically. So if you were employing that type of tech, then you would probably want to apply your mirror and then unwrap the car as a whole. So how do we go ahead and get our unwrap? Well, we can do it manually. However, this first time round, and for brevity, I'm going to unwrap using the U key, and I'm going to use Smart UV Project. Now, there are a couple of things that you need to pay attention to here. The island margin will become clear in a moment. We'll do another unwrap. Now, Smart UV Project, I love it. It's a great way of starting. Often, it's all you need to do. However, if you need more control over your UVs, then you'll probably want to manually unwrap your model. I'm going to go over to the UV editing workspace, and here we can see what that unwrap looks like. It split all of our surfaces according to our selection options here into these separate faces and projected a 3D model onto our 2D surface here. Now, if we scroll in and zoom into these areas here, we can see that there are places where it appears that the UV map is indeed touching. That will cause us problems when it comes to baking to our model. They may be noticeable problems, they may be completely unnoticeable, but there's a good chance that if our islands have no margin between them, we'll end up with a problem. So let's go ahead and re-unwrap our model, but this time under Smart UV Project, you can change the island weight, and I'm going to change it to 0.05 for the moment, and press OK. And we can see there it's given us some space between our models. Now, the space that's required depends on a lot of variables. Namely, one of the biggest ones is the resolution of your image. The lower your resolution of your images that we're going to be baking to, the higher the likelihood is that a pixel that's supposed to be representing this particular part of the unwrap ends up also influencing one over here, which it's not supposed to. One of the things that I find helps a lot is up in the top left, we've got this option here to sync the UV selection. By doing that, you can see, boom, we can see what's being selected. In this case, everything. However, if I turn to face select mode, we can see which ones are being selected, which is incredibly useful, as we'll see in a bit, for a bit of debugging. Okay, So we've got everything sorted out here. We also need an image to bake to. I'm going to, in the UV editor, I'm just going to click new image at the top, and I'm going to give the name car_AO for ambient occlusion. That's quite a common naming paradigm. And I'm going to set the resolution here. It doesn't really matter, but because this is a main object of the game, I'm going to set it as 2048. We could have it higher, we could have it lower. It doesn't really matter. Under the color, I'm going to make sure that it's set to alpha. So when I create the image, everything is blank. That's important later on, as you'll see, we'll be able to see where we've rendered and where we haven't. Where we haven't rendered, otherwise, in that case, with it being black, would have been black, and so would the background. So we wouldn't know if it actually rendered out that or it hadn't. Okay, so that looks pretty good to me at the moment. The next thing to do is start rendering out. Now, this particular model has multiple materials. It's why I've picked this one and not a very simple scene. So hopefully it will help you diagnose problems you have when trying to render out any textures that you want to render. So if we have a look at the number of materials this has got, I think it's got 6 or 7. We've got car, dark, glass, metal. Looks like we've got 2 metals there, so I'm going to remove one of them. Unable to remove it in edit mode. Yes, sir. Let's remove it outside. Okay, so that looks good there. And none of the... Oh, metal is being used in multiple places by the looks of it. But it's also being used on the tyres, of course. So that's the other instance of it being used. Okay, so we have 7 materials. So we need to make sure that this particular image that we've created is available in each one of those 7 materials. Now, if we have a look, this will cause us issues, by the way. I've set it up so it does. This is an unfinished model, so it's bound to cause some issues. If we go over to our shading tab when we start setting things up, we'll need to be able to switch between those materials, and you can do that either in this slot option in the middle of a screen here, or by having the materials open on the side. I prefer to have the materials open on the side, so I can just click and whiz through them. So the idea here is that we have the image selected. You can see this has already got a node set up so I can move textures into it. However, if you have textures here, and let's say this one's selected, and when we bake later on, this will be overwritten. We don't want that to happen. So we need to be very careful when it comes to baking what we're going to overwrite, or certainly what we end up saving, which is more of an issue, by the way, if, like me a lot of the time, I have my external data automatically packed into the blend file. This is one of the downsides, that you can end up overwriting data you've got. So make sure you save often as you're doing this process, so you can go back a step if you inadvertently end up baking something incorrectly. Okay, next thing to do here is go ahead and add in an image texture here. Now, you can do this in multiple ways. We could duplicate the one here, or we could Shift A and add in an image texture by searching. This is now the active object, the active node in our scene. And we can tell that because it's got a white border. And now we can go and select, and we can see we've got other textures in here as well. We can go ahead and select that new image that we created. Or we should be able to. Did I not create a new image? Car AO. So we should see, oh, it's right at the top. I missed it. So now that is selected, we should be able to render to it. But we've got all of our other materials on the side here to also render to. So I'm going to make sure that this is selected, Car AO. And then I'm going to go Control and C to copy that node. Now I can go down each one of my materials and paste it in. Now make sure when you're pasting it in, your cursor is over the node window. If it's anywhere else, you won't be pasting that node into the window. So we can do the same for glass, metal, paste that in. Let's have a look at metal. Nothing got pasted in. There it is. So do make sure you're pasting these things in. Car AO, light. In fact, we'll repurpose light later on, as you'll see. So we've got Car AO, we can see it's being used 7 times, which is great because I've pasted it into 7 materials. It's not a perfect check, but it's a good way of starting. And now it's our baking time. Do make sure you save at this point. It'll also give you a place to go back to if you inadvertently overwrite a texture by accident. I'm going to go ahead to my render properties. For this example, I'm going to turn down my render samples to 16. It'll be nice and quick to render out. Not here. We need to change our rendering options. I'm looking in the wrong place. Change this to cycles. We cannot currently bake in Eevee. We're going to have to use cycles. I'm going to use my CPU for doing this. It seems to be quicker than my GPU for some reason with ambient occlusion. My render samples, this is where I'm going to set it down to 16, just so it's nice and quick. It's for brevity for the video. I'm going to change my viewport here but to UV editing so I can see what happens. And then it's just a matter of coming down to bake. When we come down to bake, we've got a series of options. Combined is not what we want. We want ambient occlusion. And you can see there are several other types of map you can bake out as well. So we've got ambient occlusion selected. The final thing is this margin here. 16 pixels is likely to mean that we end up with overlapping data and causing a mess over on our UV unwrap. So what I'm going to do there is just turn that down to 2 pixels, and then I'll inspect my image later on to see if anything's missing or overlapping. Okay, that all looks good. I'm going to cross my fingers now and pray to the unwrapping and baking gods that this works, because sometimes you end up with issues. Let's see. Blimey, that looks good. Now, that was nice and quick. The reason why that was nice and quick was because our render samples were down at 16, and that really shows itself here, where we should have a small gradient. We just get a splattering of greys in between that black and white. If we turn up the samples, we'll see that smoother, and I'll show you that in a bit. So we have this view here with ambient occlusion. We have some black areas. We have black areas in between our models where things are being occluded by extra geometry. So this particular area here, make sure UV sync is turned on. Where is that? I don't know where that is. Let's go ahead and turn on solid view and look through the model. Okay, it's this part here. So it's being occluded by the wheel. Makes sense. No light is getting to those areas. And then when we come here, well, that's the back of the car by the looks of things. Now notice it's only half the wheel. That's important because it's being mirrored. This is half the wheel because it's on the other side. So all of that is absolutely fine. It looks pretty good. But there are these areas that are completely black. Now, one of the things I'll point out at this time, this is just an artifact of construction. And if you were doing Boolean operations and things like that, you would need a solid mesh. I'm not. I'm done with this in this particular instance. So we can go ahead and select anything that is pure black, which happens to be these ones here. And these are internal faces. That's why they are 100% black. So what I'm going to do is delete them. That is an optimization step. Now, obviously, they're still baked onto our image. So what we can do at this point is we can select our model again, go U, Smart UV Project, and obviously we can change these options here. So if we set this down to 15, we'll get a different unwrap. In fact, that looks a bit more optimized in many ways in terms of the space it's taking up than if it's larger. But if it's very bitty, you can end up with more artifacting where all of these bits of image end up joining together. So I'm going to stick it back at the 66 that it comes with normally. And we can see that it's now taking up more space than it was doing before, which is great. It means there's going to be more detail for those particular faces because they're covering more pixels of our image. So that's all well and good. We can go ahead and hit bake. Now I make sure that I have clear image selected, so it actually clears the image before we end up baking it. Otherwise it can be difficult to see what's overwritten what. And there we go. That is all done and dusted. We can now export this and use it in our game. But before we do that, I do want to show you here that if I increase the render here to something silly like 512, you do reach a point of diminishing returns, by the way. There's only so many pixels here that we can render on. So, and whilst we're zoomed in, by the way, this margin option that we've got down here of 2 pixels, that's exactly what we see either side of the lines. If it's too low, you can end up with information missing. But these are 2 pixels either side. So that's all good. I'm going to bake this now to show you the higher quality output that you can get. And then we are all done and dusted. Okay, so we're about to finish off the render here, and I'm going to end up zooming in to this area that we had the wheel on, and you can see that's a much smoother gradient. It's a more accurate representation of the ambient occlusion of our model. The final thing I want to do here, and I've got this model backed up and saved, so I'm just going to go ahead and save this file, and then I'm going to go save as, create, well actually let's save a copy, and I'm going to fix this with 2 at the end. There we go. So I've saved this copy and I'm going to hijack the light material. The reason for that is it's an emission. Can't remove slots whilst in edit mode. There we go. So we have our light material. I'm going to go into shading. It's got its strength set at 10. I'm going to turn it down to 1. And I'm just going to plug my car AO into the car's emission. And there we go. We've got ourselves an ambient occlusion map ready to use externally or internally to Blender. Awesome. Now, if you've liked this video, and I hope you have and found it informative, please like, share it, and if you want more great tips like this, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll catch you all later. Take care.